The first days of our marriage felt like a dream. Eric, the man who held me with his love, was the solid, dependable person at the center of my life. When we got married and moved into our small but cozy home, I thought everything would continue this way. We would have breakfast together in the mornings and come home tired but happy in the evenings. My life was flowing peacefully and simply. When I held Eric's hands, my hopes for the future grew even more. The warmth of his hands, the compassion in his eyes, made me feel like I was in the safest place in the world. Every touch, every gaze, had the power to erase all my dark thoughts. But this peaceful life was shaken by the sudden death of my mother-in-law. That day is still vivid in my mind. When I saw the deep sorrow in Eric's eyes while he was talking to his brother on the phone, I felt something break inside me. My mother-in-law was one of the strongest bonds in Eric's life, and her loss deeply affected all of us. Eric couldn't recover for a long time. But it was my father-in-law who took the real blow. He rapidly deteriorated after my mother-in-law passed away. Both his health and his morale worsened day by day. He was becoming more and more dependent on others. Eric felt a deep responsibility toward his father and did not want to leave him alone. The loss of my mother-in-law was a turning point for all of us. The sorrow in Eric's eyes wiped away the dazzling hope he had for life in an instant. The gloom that descended upon the house during those days affected us all. My father-in-law's decline was more apparent. The light in his eyes had faded, his body was growing weaker with each passing day. Eric's sense of duty toward his father brought a new burden into our lives, but we would bear this burden together. One day, Eric came to me and said, "Let's take my dad in, he can't stay alone anymore," and I didn't object. I had to support him, after all. In these difficult times, I believed that as a family, we needed to hold on to each other more tightly. Taking my father-in-law into our home initially seemed like just an act of sacrifice. Eric would go to work, and I would take care of him all day. There was an atmosphere of sorrow brought on by illness and death in the house. Yet, I endured by trying to meet my father-in-law's needs. At first, taking my father-in-law into our home seemed like the right decision, but over time, the change in the atmosphere of the house became noticeable. Eric's love and dedication to his father were a great source of motivation to support him during these tough days. However, as I spent the entire day alone with my father-in-law, that silent and dark shadow in the house became more and more dominant. The sorrow brought by illness and the pain of loss created a gloom that affected our daily lives, but I still wanted to support Eric in bearing this burden. However, as time went by, along with the silence in the house, I began to feel a different unease. After Eric left for work, my father-in-law's looks started to change. What initially seemed like mere sadness and loneliness in his eyes began to tell me something else. A sense of unease would arise in me each morning as Eric left the house, though I couldn't quite figure out why. My father-in-law's gaze hovered over me like a shadow, but I didn't even want to admit it to myself. The change in my father-in-law's gaze dragged me into a deep unease. Each morning when Eric left the house, the sounds coming from my father-in-law's room and the expression on his face disturbed me. His look seemed as though they were hiding something, desperate yet also threatening. I tried to convince myself not to make a big deal of it, but the unease inside me grew stronger every day. I avoided telling Eric about it, trying to handle everything on my own. One morning, Eric got ready to leave for work, and as soon as he closed the door, I heard my father-in-law's door open. He came to me with slow steps. I wanted to get up from where I was sitting, but he placed his hand on my shoulder. My hair stood on end. A voice inside me said, "Stay calm, he's just sad, he needs you." But that touch wasn't normal, it pressed coldly and threateningly on my shoulder. That day, my father-in-law said, "I just want to be alone for a while, will you come?" My heart started to pound. I felt something was changing inside me, but I couldn't say no to him. That morning marked the true beginning of a nightmare for me. The moment my father-in-law put his hand on my shoulder, the fear that came over me enveloped my entire being. I wanted to think he was genuinely in need of help, but the threatening feeling in his touch made that impossible. His words, which seemed innocent, carried an underlying threat. The helplessness of being unable to say no pulled me into a much deeper fear. Taking care of him felt like my duty, but the unease within me grew. That morning, as I went to my father-in-law's room, the discomfort inside me had become unbearable. He was sitting on the bed, staring at me with empty eyes. "Come, sit for a while," he said in a calm voice. I wanted to resist his words, but my body wouldn't move. I sat beside him, but there was a heavy burden within me, and I knew something was wrong. He started talking about his lost wife and the bond with his son. I tried to console him, but with every sentence, he got closer to me. The emptiness in his eyes seemed to lay bare the darkness he hid inside. The moment I sat beside him, the weight that settled over me deepened my sense of helplessness. His approach as he spoke made my fear grow. Every word I said to comfort him felt like an invisible barrier between us, but this barrier seemed ready to collapse at any moment. In those moments, I feared that my unease would be justified. His conversation gradually took on a darker tone. His hands came over mine, and he said, "You are such a beautiful woman, you know that?" I felt like I was drowning, but I didn't have the strength to resist him. His grip tightened, the darkness in his eyes deepening as my fear grew. The words were stuck in my throat, I didn't know what to say. When he started to caress my cheek, my whole body seemed to freeze. In that moment, all I wanted was to run away from the room, but I didn't know how. I quickly came up with an excuse and got away from there. The moment his hands touched mine, the storm inside me imprisoned my entire being. Not being able to resist him amplified my sense of helplessness. The darkness in his eyes was like a vortex that pulled me in. The words were lodged in my chest, refusing to come out. In those moments, my only wish was to find an excuse and escape from his dark gaze. When I finally found an opportunity to get away, I felt a slight sense of relief, but I knew this nightmare wasn't over yet. I thought I needed to tell Eric, but fear and shame held me back. If Eric faced his father's condition, he would be devastated, and even worse things could happen. So, I chose to remain silent for a while, trying to ignore what had happened and bury myself in my daily chores. But that was just the beginning. A few days later, the same scenario played out again. As soon as Eric left for work, my father-in-law called me to his room again. This time he was more insistent, and despite my fear, I couldn't resist his orders. Telling Eric about the situation was the biggest internal battle I faced. I didn't want him to confront his father, as I feared it could lead to a far greater pain. For that reason, keeping silent and keeping everything to myself felt like the right decision. But my fear and anxiety grew day by day. As my father-in-law's harassment continued, maintaining my daily life became nearly impossible. I felt trapped in a cycle of helplessness, wanting to escape from everything and free myself from this nightmare, but I didn't know how. I felt like I was trapped in my own home, losing a piece of my soul every day. I couldn't tell Eric, it was impossible to look him in the eyes and explain what had happened. My father-in-law's behavior was becoming more frightening, but I couldn't find a solution. There was an ongoing struggle within me. On one side was my father-in-law's illness and Eric's devotion to his family, and on the other side were my fears and shame. Being a prisoner in my own home led to a point where I couldn't even control my thoughts. Not being able to tell Eric created deep shame and sorrow within me. Every night, as I thought about what had happened, my tears soaked my pillow, but when I woke up in the morning, I tried to act like everything was forgotten. This silent struggle was consuming me day by day, making me more helpless in the face of my father-in-law's actions. I knew I needed to find a solution, but I had no idea what that solution could be. One day, I felt I couldn't take it anymore and decided I had to prove everything my father-in-law had done. Keeping silent had brought me nothing but more harassment from him. I had reached my breaking point. I secretly made a plan and placed a camera in his room, recording everything. I knew this nightmare would come to an end. I had realized that I needed to find a way out before I completely broke down. What my father-in-law was doing had become unbearable, and I had to put an end to it. The idea of setting up a camera came from a place of desperation, a glimmer of hope. Recording these moments with my phone would reveal his true face. I believed these recordings would bring back my strength. I was no longer going to stay silent, I would write my own story. That evening when Eric came home, I didn't know how to tell him. Sharing this secret about his father was difficult, but I could no longer maintain the silence. My hand went to my phone, but before showing the video, a knot formed in my stomach. I had no idea how Eric would react. One evening, I gathered the courage to go to the police station. I showed them the video evidence I had. When my father-in-law was taken into custody, I felt a bit of relief. Telling Eric about the situation was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made. Taking the video evidence to the police station and ensuring that my father-in-law was taken into custody gave me a small sense of relief. But this situation brought great devastation to Eric's life. At that moment, I had to explain everything that had happened to him, but the fear inside me created concerns about how he would cope with this reality. Still, staying silent was no longer an option, and I had taken the step to end this nightmare. Eric found out about the situation and was angry at me for not telling him. I told him I wanted to protect him. He sat silently, not saying a word for minutes. Facing his father was very difficult for him, but in the end, he accepted it and said, "This is unforgivable." He was shattered by his father's imprisonment, but he didn't blame me. The silence between us gave way to understanding, and we both waited for the wounds to heal over time. When Eric sat there silently listening to me, I felt a mix of relief and worry. His anger towards me made everything that had happened even more difficult, but in the end, he understood that it wasn't my fault. What his father did was unforgivable, and he had to face this truth. This confrontation turned into a quiet acceptance between us, and we decided to support each other. Although it would take time for the scars left by these events to heal, I knew we could get through this ordeal together. After my father-in-law went to prison, the dark shadow in the house vanished, but what I had experienced was not easily forgotten. It left deep marks on me, both physically and mentally. We could also feel these wounds in my relationship with Eric. But now I was free, I had fought for myself and escaped from this nightmare. Though the scars of the past wouldn't easily close, I believed I would eventually find peace. I knew that after these dark days, Eric and I could step into a brighter future together. The disappearance of the dark shadow in the house restored my freedom. However, the traces left by these events were too profound to ignore. The effects of these scars were evident in my relationship with Eric, sometimes in the silence, sometimes in the distant look in our eyes that reminded us of what had happened. But being free, having fought for myself, gave me back a great deal of strength. Though the marks of the past wouldn't easily fade, I knew we could look to the future with hope after these dark days. The only thing I needed to find peace was time, and I believed that, with Eric, this time would heal our wounds. This story was a fight for my life in which I found my voice amidst the cruelty of every moment I stayed silent. I would no longer stay silent, I would build my future fearlessly. Every moment I stayed silent showed me how I lost my voice. These events weren't just about my father-in-law's harassment but also allowed me to bring forth the courage and strength within me. Instead of staying silent, I chose to speak up, overcome my fears, and build my future fearlessly. This struggle for survival showed me that, despite everything, I could find a way out. It was time for me to write my own story, and I was determined to write it in the most beautiful way possible.